You do the math. So the science isn't there to back up the threat of environmental Armageddon, yet the policies move forward unabated. Why? I believe the true agenda is to restructure the United States of America away from a representative republic where liberty and property are protected, where individuals reign supreme, where free speech is unfettered, and where opportunity and free enterprise are the economics of choice. I believe there is a vast political movement afoot that intends to restructure the nation into a global neighborhood, without sovereign national boundaries, without free elected governments, and without individual liberty or property rights of any kind. I believe it is the same socialist agenda that the left has tried to force on us since its inception. But now, under the guise of saving the environment, Americans are accepting it with open arms, unaware of the true nature of the beast. Let me show you how it's being done. In 1992, the radical environmental journal Wild Earth, published by Earth First founder Dave Foreman, produced a special report announcing what it called the Wildlands Project, plotting a North American wilderness recovery strategy. This outrageous plan called for the, quote, rewilding of at least 50% of all the land in every state in America, not just let's rewild the West and leave the East alone, 50% of all the area in every single state. In the introduction, Foreman writes, quote, the idea is simple. To stem the disappearance of wildlife and wilderness, we must allow the recovery of whole ecosystems and landscapes in every region of North America. Allowing these systems to recover requires a long-term master plan. And Foreman intended for the Wildlands Project to be that master plan. The project mapped out ecoregions and biosphere reserves that were intermingled. It didn't matter if private homes or farms or even whole towns were in the middle. The project called for redistributing people, homes, and towns out of predetermined biosphere reserves. Foreman's Wildlands Project called for reintroducing wolves and grizzly bears. It called for shutting down the timber industry and eliminating cattle from grazing lands and farms. It also called for the closing of roads and the destruction of dams and bridges. Does any of this sound familiar to any of you? And the Wildlands Project ignored community, state, and national boundaries. Foreman said, quote, we live to see the day when grizzlies in Mexico have an unbroken connection with grizzlies in Alaska, when the gray wolf populations are continuous from New Mexico to Greenland, when vast unbroken forests and flowing plains again thrive and support pre-Christopher Columbus populations of plants and animals. And in such a vision, there is very little room for people. The plan is radical beyond imagination. Most Americans, if they knew of its details, would simply not take it as a serious threat to our way of life. The Wildlands Project was dismissed by many to be just the ravings of a green zealot. But later that same year, 1992, in Rio de Janeiro, the United Nations held an international conference on the environment called the Earth Summit. One result of the conference was the production of an international agreement called the Biodiversity Treaty. It was to be signed and ratified into international law by each participating nation. Would you be shocked to learn that the Biodiversity Treaty contains most of the language and provisions of the Wildlands Project? And it does. And the result is that the radical idea of a green zealot quickly soared onto the international stage to become a threat to America's very way of life. But to strengthen it further, next came a host of UN-sponsored international conferences solidifying a wide range of the radical green agenda. In Cairo, forced abortion and sterilization were touted as the tools of choice to force lower populations. In Copenhagen, the UN revealed its daring plan for global taxes that would help finance the international restructuring scheme envisioned by the radical environmentalists. And of course, in December of 1997 in Kyoto, Japan, a bold scheme to reduce American industry and redistribute American wealth was mapped out in the Global Warming Treaty. But it was in Istanbul, Turkey in 1996, at a conference called Habitat 2, where the real restructuring blueprint was revealed. Here, UN delegates and environmentalists boldly revealed the blueprint for implementing an agenda that would begin to turn our towns and cities into environmentally friendly urban clusters. At that UN conference, the Clinton administration, through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, presented the master plan called Community Sustainability Agendas for Choice Making and Action. It wasn't your choice. The HUD proposal became the basis of the UN's plan to downsize cities, turn back the use of medicines and chemicals that are determined by the government to be hazardous to the environment, eliminate the use of cars, air conditioners, and suburban housing. Industry, private property, and freedom of travel would be severely curtailed. Again, at Habitat 2, the focus was on world populations and how to eliminate people. And the plan calls for a deadline of 15 to 20 years from completion of the process. Does that sound too radical? Well, I have here an original draft copy printed on official HUD stationery. This is an official Clinton administration policy, a blueprint for future American and international environmental plans to change how we will work, how we will live, in its vision of an environmentally correct world. This report represents a totalitarian nightmare right out of the pages of George Orwell's 1984. The report calls for, quote, remapping modern society's new third millennium reality. Where do they get these words? Using what it calls community sustainability. These are code words used by today's radical environmentalist movement, meaning all human activity is damaging to the earth and therefore must be changed or stopped. This remapping, according to the HUD report, would include the downsizing of cities and towns into new urban clusters where workplaces, housing, and nature are blended together. Residents of these urban clusters must then take part in collective public visioning, and they will be held accountable for achieving a rapid transition to community sustainability. All citizens, that's you we're talking about, will be trained to think of the ecology or the diverse system of the Earth's biosphere as the basis for every human activity. In other words, propaganda and behavior modification. Keep those words in mind, behavior modification, because they're going to pop up a little bit later here. Propaganda and behavior modification methods will be employed to assure that citizens achieve the proper attitudes to transfer the United States of America into a basically agrarian society surrounded by wilderness. But the nightmare gets worse. According to this official document of the Clinton administration, these new environmentally correct human habitat areas will contain daycare centers, consumer collectives, something like the company store, I guess, work-share plans, co-ops, and tool libraries. In other words, agriculture will be performed on specific land controlled by the government, where tools lent out for the task. Apparently, private ownership of such dangerous utensils will be prohibited. But children will be well cared for in government-run daycare centers. And for agriculture, toxic chemical fertilizers, meaning anything produced by man to improve production and eliminate pests, will be eliminated, and remineralization of the soil will depend on indigenous waste, ash, compost, this I'm quoting from this report, and ground up concrete and asphalt. And where will they get that? How about those roads we won't need after cars are banned? Producing livestock for human consumption will be drastically reduced, and instead, pasture land will be used for growing grains that humans will eat. Foods and medicines that cause environmental side effects will be banned. Homes and communities set up in the specific human habitat areas will be crowded, multifamily, low-rise residential developments made of indigenous materials. These communities will encourage pedestrian-oriented travel with bike paths and healthier walking and running paths instead of cars. Public transportation will be basically light rail trains. And you remember, long ago, how America was originally established. Locally elected governments, such as mayors, town councils, and county commissioners, were in charge of maintaining roads, providing police and fire protection, and community development. Well, not anymore, according to HUD. We can still have elected dignitaries, of course, to cut ribbons and make us feel like we have a say in government affairs, but our new government will be assigned by the federal government through the establishment of local urban environmental design administrators. These government-appointed, non-elected dictators will control the development of human habitat and make sure that it fits the proper environmental designs and landscape planning to assure community sustainability. It is vital that each and every one of you fully understand the implications of this plan. Let me be very clear. If you remember nothing else that I say here today, remember these two words: sustainable development. And remember this: sustainable development is your enemy. Sustainability, sustainable communities, sustainable development, sustainable agriculture, these are not simply a comprehensive approach to environmental protection. The reoccurring theme throughout official sustainability literature and documents is the integration of economic, equity, and environmental policies. In other words, sustainable development represents the entire agenda of the left that you and I have been fighting against all of our lives. In a policy report by Stephen C. Hackett, a leading proponent of the Sustainable Development Plan, he says, quote, "Our contemporary form of market capitalism may not be consistent with sustainability." The President's Council on Sustainable Development in its official report said, quote, "Sustainable development requires fundamental change in the conduct of government, private institutions, and individuals." That grandiose language is translated in policy by specific recommendations and presidential executive orders which use the environment as an excuse to manage the economy to achieve social equity. And you and I know that social equity really means redistribution of the wealth. What does that have to do with saving the environment? Air conditioning, convenience foods, single-family housing, and cars are among the products already determined to be unsustainable. All are targets of the UN's Global Warming Treaty, and the Clinton administration is moving ahead with its implementation through executive order in spite of the fact that the U.S. Senate has not and will not ratify it. Under the sustainability plan, environmental protection means constraining individual freedom to accommodate management, to prevent the impending impoverishment of the planet. Management is not the government. The government is simply the instrument for enforcing the dictates of management. Management is actually non-government organizations, NGOs, headed by the big three, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the World Wildlife Fund, and the World Resources Institute. Coincidentally, Jonathan Lash, president of the World Resources Institute, is co-chairman of President Clinton's Council on Sustainable Development. Further, it is the United Nations and only the United Nations that designates NGO organizations. These NGOs have set the ideological agenda. They have created a worldwide network of affiliated NGOs like the Sierra Club, the Audubon Society, the Nature Conservancy, and Earth First. These NGOs are well positioned and adequately funded to implement that agenda. And through UN-created international treaties like the Biodiversity Treaty, language is specifically written to give NGOs outright legal status to manage national, state, and local governments as well as the lives of individual citizens. All the government has to do is sign the treaty, and it's a done deal. Sustainability councils dominated by NGOs are being formed in every single community. These councils coordinate their activity with regional councils also dominated by NGOs. Ultimately, each bioregion, not city or state, is to have a bioregional council to coordinate or manage the activities within that bioregion. The function of governments within the bioregion will be simply to enforce the dictates of the council.